Good evening to everybody. It's great to be with you tonight. Appreciate the invitation to come back and join you on your summer series. Recently, I've been battling allergies. I'm sure there's no allergens out here in Elk City, so maybe I'll get a reprieve. I've been battling allergies pretty bad. I help coach a football team in Norman, a middle school team, pretty close to the church building, and just being out in the grass has not been good for me here recently. So if I start hacking, if I start coughing, I don't have COVID. I don't have tuberculosis. It'll be okay. Just give me a minute. I'll catch my breath and we'll start going again. In Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23, here Solomon, he urges all people to do something that's very important. In fact, Solomon, he places it at the very top of the list. He says, above all. When you come across a phrase like that in the Bible, it should get your attention. If there's something that is of first importance, if there's something that's above other things, then we should pay attention. And Solomon goes on to tell us that above all, we should guard our hearts, for it is the wellspring of life. What does it mean to guard our hearts? How do we do that? What exactly is our heart? In the Hebrew language, there wasn't an actual word for brain. There's not a Hebrew word for our brain. That's why in Deuteronomy chapter 6, as Moses is talking about loving God, as he writes to the Israelites, talks to them before they go into the promised land, he tells them to love God with all of their heart, all of their soul, and all of their strength. The word heart that Moses used, the word heart that Solomon used, was the Hebrew word that described a person's essence. It was that person's being, everything that they were, everything that you are as a human being is encompassed in that word heart. Now, if Solomon were writing today, and he were to write the words of Proverbs 4, verse 23, more than likely he would say, above all else, guard your brain. Above all else, guard your mind. That's what Solomon is talking about. He's talking about building a fence around our mind so that Satan is not able to penetrate. That the enemy is not able to come in and get possession of the most important thing that we have, our mind, the center of who we are. Now, what does this look like for us today? To answer that question, I want us to go to the New Testament. And there's a text in Colossians chapter 3 where Paul is writing to the church at Colossae. And within this text, Paul uses that word mind. And he shows these Christians how they can do that, how they can protect their minds. In Colossians 3, beginning in verse 1, Paul, he's reminding these Christians of certain things. Therefore, if you've been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you will also be revealed with him in glory. This text, it shows us how to accomplish what Solomon wrote about way back in Proverbs 4, verse 23. So let's break this text down here in Colossians 3. We'll start with the first phrase. Therefore, if you have been raised up with Christ. This is baptism language. This is Paul reminding the church at Colossae, reminding these Christians of the moment that they were immersed into Christ. Do you remember that day? Do you remember that moment when you were immersed into Christ? Do you remember who taught you the gospel? Maybe the people who taught you the gospel. And do you remember the occasion? Maybe it was a gospel meeting. Maybe it was a Sunday morning. Maybe it was Monday morning at 3 a.m. Maybe you were at church camp. Think back to the moment when you were immersed into Christ. That's a moment we should never forget. That's a moment that should be entrenched in our minds. It's a moment that we should think about continually. Our mind should go back to that day, to that moment when we were baptized with Christ. Because being baptized with Christ also meant that what? Well, we were raised up with Christ. That's baptism language. It's resurrection language. What is the most dramatic before and after picture you've ever seen? Back in the 1980s, shopping malls were a lot more popular than they are today. Shopping malls where teenagers hung out. Every shopping mall in big cities, it would be packed with teenagers. And the stores just lined the malls. There weren't very many vacancies. One of the popular stores back in the 80s was a business called Glamour Shots. You guys remember Glamour Shots? Glamour Shots made their money off of a before and after picture. They would have the before picture when you went in, and then they would take about 10 bottles of hairspray and about 8 vials of makeup, and they would do you up, and they would take that after picture. And they would have those pictures plastered on the front of their windows. It was a dramatic transformation for a lot of people that they could take a lot of people and make them look pretty good. Pretty dramatic transformation. In a more negative way, maybe you've seen some of the images coming out of Hawaii with the devastating fires and what Maui looked like before and what it looks like now, the devastation that's happened there. But neither of those qualifies as the most dramatic before and after picture. The most dramatic before and after picture of any person's existence is being baptized into Christ. That's more dramatic, that's more transformational than anything else, because we're talking about a transformation of the soul. And just consider what happens when we're baptized into Christ. Now, there's certain things that God does for us that we're not able to do for ourselves. We get that. There are some things that we cannot do for ourselves. There are some things that only God can do. And if God didn't step in and do it for us, we would be in trouble. So when we are immersed into Christ, we look at what God does for us, what He provides. Before we're immersed into Christ, we are in sin. After, we are forgiven. It's pretty dramatic. Before we are baptized into Christ, we are lost. After we are raised up with Christ, we're saved. Before we're baptized into Christ, spiritually we're naked. After, according to Galatians 3, we're now clothed with Christ. Before, we are engaged in the works of the flesh. After, we live by the Spirit. What a transformation. And all of this is made possible by God through Jesus Christ. It's what God accomplishes for us through His Son. Now, if you just look at that list, going from being lost to being saved, going from being in sin to being forgiven, going from being outside of the kingdom to in the kingdom, going from being naked spiritually to now clothed with Christ, what a transformation. And that's what God does for us. But there's also that element of what we do. After we're immersed into Christ, we are raised up. In the language that Paul uses in 2 Corinthians 5, he describes us as a new creation. We're a new creature. Well, what's new about us? Well, I've just described to you everything that God does for us that makes us new. What about the things that we now have to do? This is the after that involves us, that involves our choices, that involves how we live. I'm notorious in my family for losing my keys. I lose my keys all the time. My daughter's now about to turn 22 years old. My wife, she teaches, and my wife would leave before I would take our daughter to school. And there were a lot of days where I'm trying to find my keys, trying to get her to school, and my daughter got tired of it. So she got me a little tile device that I was able to put on my car keys. You just clip it on, just like a little key. And there's an app on your phone, and you can go and push that app, and it will ring, showing you where your keys are. Well, recently I'd lost my keys, and I was trying to find them everywhere. I was hunting up and down, and I finally remembered that I had this tile device on my phone. So I pushed that little button, that app, and it says low battery. I'm like, you got to be kidding. There's nothing. There's no ringtone. There's nothing going off. I'm like, ah. So I have to hunt and hunt. I can't find them anywhere. So I said, I'll go get the spare key, the key that you're never to touch. And I have this spare key, and it's one of those keys that has a battery in it. I get it, and I'm ready to head off to work. I get in the car, and that battery's dead. The battery on the tile's dead. The battery in my spare key is dead. I have to find my keys now at this point. And so I hunted for another 15 minutes, finally found them in the toolbox. I've been in my toolbox the night before. Somehow I'd put them in the toolbox. That's where I found them. When you look at your life and you're trying to identify what changed after you became a Christian, it shouldn't be that hard. It shouldn't be like me trying to find my keys on a lot of mornings. You should be able to look at your life after you were immersed into Christ and see that things were different. You should be able to see, I have a new purpose. My life is not the same. God has changed me, but now I'm living different. I have a new purpose. I have a new mission. My purpose is to glorify God. My mission is to go make disciples. This is what my life is about now. Walked into the bathroom here, and I see the nets on the wall. And there's a phrase there connected to what the apostles did. They left their nets behind. Why? Because they had a new life to follow after Jesus. It's no different with us. Following Jesus hasn't changed today. It's still the same call that it was back in the first century. Now, people may have tried to water it down, but it's the same. It takes sacrifice. It takes change. So I want you to think back to that moment. When you were immersed into Christ, what God did for you, that is guaranteed. God always comes through. I want you to think about this question. What changed in your life? How did your day-to-day living change? What did you give up that you were involved in? What did you take on that you knew I needed to be a part of? What changed? That's what Paul is trying to get these Christians to see. Therefore, if you have been raised up with Christ, what did he write next? Keep seeking the things above. What are you seeking? What are you chasing in life? We live in a blessed nation. All you have to do is go to a mission field, go to Haiti. We support missionaries in Haiti. Go there. You'll see how blessed we are. We support missionaries in Nigeria. Go there. You'll see how blessed America is. In our country, with our resources, I believe that people will find what they're looking for. Whatever it is you're seeking, whatever it is you're pursuing, whatever it is you're chasing, you're going to find it. Have you ever thought about this question? What then? What happens when I find what I'm looking for? Then what? Recently, I had an opportunity to go to Alaska. There's a young man that grew up at Westside. He was in the youth group there while I was university minister and also preaching. We grew close while he was there. And he went off to college, and he now is an Army JAG officer. And he's stationed up at J-Bear in Anchorage. It's kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to go up and see Alaska. Somebody to stay with, a tour guide to take me around all over the place. So I went up last part of June, had a blast. It was a great trip. Leading up to the trip, some of the people at Westside were talking to me about it. What are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm probably not going to fish. That's what everybody asks. You can go fishing. You can go trout fishing. You can go fish for salmon. No, probably not. I'm not much of a fisherman. So I want to do some hiking. I want to do some kayaking, some rafting. One of the people that I was talking to when I mentioned hiking, they said, "Are you going to go look for a bear?" That sounds kind of neat. Yeah, let's go look for a bear. But I said to them after I thought about it for a moment, what happens if I find one? Then what? We need to think about that spiritually. We need to think about that in our life. We need to look at what we're seeking, what we're chasing, because a lot of people, they're seeking bears and they find them. And it's like, whoa, now what? Some people seek after drugs and they find them. You can find drugs if you want drugs. Then what? Some people chase after alcohol. Find that. Then what? A life of addiction? Some people chase after extramarital affairs. You can find them if you want them. Then what? Broken families? Broken hearts? Shattered children? We don't think about the then what. We just chase after all of these things. We're like Solomon. We're just kind of chasing after the wind, hoping to find purpose, hoping to find direction. And we don't think it through. Paul, he reminds these Christians, you've been raised up with Christ. Keep seeking the things above. How often do you actively seek Jesus? Now, we have the apostles in the first century, and we can visualize them. Maybe you've watched the series The Chosen. And you've seen these men, you've seen these women as they're pursuing Jesus. And physically, they're chasing after Jesus. They're walking after Jesus. Now, for us, Jesus, he's no longer here on earth. But we can still seek him, can't we? He isn't dead. He's still alive. And he's not hiding in a corner. He's available to us. And just like all of these other things, these negative things that you can find if you want, if you want to find Jesus, you can find him. In James 4, James writes, draw near to God, and what will happen? He will draw near to us. He'll draw near to you. You can be as close to God as you want to be. You can be as close to Jesus as you want to be. It's up to you. God has made himself available through his Son. You can have an intimate relationship with God. God knows you intimately. You can have that same knowledge of God. You can be as close to God as you want to be. Seek him and you will find. The opposite is also true. You can be as distant from God as you want to be. You can be as far removed from God as you want to be. The imagery of Luke 15, the prodigal son, he wanted to get away from the father and he wanted to get as far away from him as possible. So he traveled to that far, far land, that Gentile country. Finally came to his senses and he came back. And his father, who was longing to see him, he sees him off in the horizon. He sprints after him. He doesn't walk, he doesn't jog, he is sprinting after his son. The father was always there. What changed? The prodigal finally came to his senses. He could have had that closeness with his father that entire time period if he wanted. So can you. Keep seeking the things above. And we're not chasing a moving target. My father-in-law, his words of advice for my wife when she was growing up, if somebody's shooting at you, run in zigzags. Make it tough. Make it difficult. He was a farmer. He was a hunter. That was some of the advice he gave her. When we're trying to find Jesus, he's not running zigzags from us. We know exactly where he's at. He's reigning at the right hand of God. Now, sometimes when we think about the work of Jesus, our mind goes to what Jesus has already done for us, what Jesus has done in the past. Maybe our thoughts go to the cross, and that's a great place for our minds to go. What Jesus accomplished for us at Calvary. His body broken, his body battered. And then him being taken down, his body taken down, buried in a tomb, and then him rising again. Maybe that's what we think about when we consider the work of Jesus. Do you think about what Jesus is doing right now for you, for me? The work of Jesus isn't done. Jesus is reigning at the right hand of God. And at this very moment, Jesus continues to work on our behalf. Now, we have an enemy that's working against us, our adversary, the accuser. And I picture the judgment day. I picture Satan, the accuser, making all of these accusations against us. Remember when he did that? Remember when she was involved in this? And Satan just making accusations left and right against us. And we're sitting right there. We're on trial. And we know all of it is true. And we think, oh, I'm in trouble. And then Jesus, he steps in as our advocate, our mediator. And he says, wait a minute. He's with me. She's with me. At this very moment, Jesus is advocating on our behalf before the Father. At this very moment, Jesus is our mediator between us and God, making that connection possible. And Jesus is able to turn to his Father and say to him, I know what they're going through. Jesus has been tempted in all things as we are, yet he was without sin. Jesus knows what it's like to live a day here on earth. He knows what it's like to suffer. He knows what it's like to go through difficult times. He knows what it's like to experience loss, experience disappointment, experience hunger, experience thirst, experience people betraying him, disappointing him. He knows humanity. He knows us. And so at this very moment, Jesus is able to turn to God and say, I know what they're going through. I know what he's facing. I know what she's facing. Think about it. That's what Paul urges these Christians to do. Set your mind on the things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Next, Paul writes, set your mind on the things above, not on things that are on earth. What do you think Satan's goal is for Christians? I think about it this way. I'm a sports guy. I think about Satan trying to find just one thing that is more important to us than God. Competition. I like competition. And Satan is actively competing for your soul. Now, Jesus, he competed for your soul, and he made salvation possible for all of us. But now Satan knows he can't get Christ, so he's after us, his children. So Satan is actively competing for our soul, and he's trying to just find one thing in your life that is more important to you than God is. You see, Satan doesn't have to find 5 things. He doesn't have to find 4 things or 3 things. He just needs one. For some people, it's money. For some people, it's stuff. For some people, it's power. He's just trying to find that one thing that you love more than God. He's competing for your soul. Now, how does he do it? Well, he's attacking the mind. Remember what Solomon wrote in Proverbs 4:23, set your mind on the thing, above all else, guard your heart. Remember that? Above all else, guard your heart. That's what Satan is after. He's trying to find a way in through the gate. He's trying to find a way in to grab our mind, to grab our heart. Well, how does he do it? Oh, there's a myriad of ways that he does. I'll share 2 ways that he does it. There's a lot of epidemics in our society. There's 2 that I'll bring to your attention. One of them is pornography. Pornography is an epidemic in our society. A lot of times we attach it to men. It's not just a problem for men. A lot of times we just attach it to our youth. It's not just a problem for youth. It's a problem. And what that does, what pornography does, it changes your mind. It rewires your mind. Now, none of us would give a brain surgeon permission to go in cut through our skull and start rewiring our brain. We wouldn't give somebody permission to do that unless we really needed surgery. That's what we're doing with some of these things. That's what pornography does. It rewires the mind. It changes the way you view sexuality. It changes the way you view the opposite sex. And Satan is using that to attack our minds. We have to guard against it. With your children, with your grandchildren. Saw a statistic. It was scary. 78% of people under 22 view pornography regularly. 78%. It's a lot. And what they're doing is they're getting their minds rewired. I'll give you another one. Probably have it on you right now. These little things. Cell phones, they change your mind. Our culture has changed a lot since 1991. I graduated from high school in 1991. That was before Al Gore invented the internet. You go back to 1991, we didn't have the technology we have today. But something that emerged from the COVID years was the isolation that people are feeling and how that's affecting their lives, how that's affecting their minds. And all of these social media apps that are popular in our world today, starting with Facebook, and you have Instagram, you have TikTok, you got Twitter, which is now X. All of these social media apps, they create artificial connections. But what's missing is community. What's missing is the face-to-face interaction. And you have young people especially that view their self-worth through how many likes they get on a TikTok video, or they view their self-worth based on how many followers they have on Instagram. And what cell phones have done in a lot of people's lives, it has created depression. And you have people, especially our young people, that are battling depression because of this. And we're carrying it around with us. And Satan has taken something that is neutral. A cell phone is neither good nor bad. We could all make a list of positives for having a cell phone. We can make a list of negatives for having it. But a cell phone in and of itself is neutral. It's how you use it. And Satan takes something that's neutral and he uses it against us. And the area where he attacks is right here, the mind. He is after our mind. That's why what Solomon wrote, above all else, of first importance, guard your mind. And I think it's harder to do that today than it's ever been in our world. Because of all of these things that Satan has taken and twisted and perverted and used against us. Then we get to verse 4, perhaps my favorite verse in the Bible. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you will also be revealed with him in glory. If you look at the Apostle Paul's life before he became a Christian, then you look at his life after he became a Christian, you talk about a dramatic transformation. Perhaps the most dramatic of all people. Before Saul became a Christian, he was persecuting the church. He was on a mission to destroy Christ, to destroy the church. And he went to great lengths. He traveled great distances to wreak his havoc on the church. And he had a purpose. And you look at Saul's life at that point, everybody knew what Saul's life was about. Before Saul became a Christian, his life was persecuting the Christ, persecuting the church. Now, after he became a Christian, it's just as easy now to see what his life was about. After he became a Christian, you see this man now, he's traveling everywhere, preaching the name of Jesus. He's sharing the gospel. After Paul became a Christian, his life was Christ. Paul could write the statement that we see in Colossians 3, verse 4. When Christ, who is our life, Jesus was life for the Apostle Paul. What's the first thing you think of when you wake up in the morning? What's the last thing you think of before you go to sleep at night? I can tell you what Paul's was. First thing he thought of in the morning was Jesus. How can I reach one more soul? Last thing that he thought of was Jesus. Paul's life was Jesus. Now, if you spend time with anybody, any amount of significant time, you will be able to answer that question. What is their life? You can ask your kids, if they were to fill in that blank, my life is fill in the blank. It'd be kind of scary to ask people to complete that statement. Ask your kids to complete that statement. What's my life about? Ask your son, ask your daughter. My life is what? Money, sports, hunting, possessions. My life is what? In everybody's life, there is something that takes preeminence. In everybody's life, there is something that is supreme above everything else. What is that for you? What is most important in your life? Now, it's easy for us to kind of rationalize some things, maybe pretend everything's okay. The one thing that Satan wants, he wants us to think we're okay, even when we're not. Because if we think we're okay, we're not going to take any steps to change anything. One of the hardest things to do, and I see this in youth sports because of my coaching, one of the most difficult things to do is to be objective with ourselves. It may be more challenging to be objective with our kids. Yesterday after practice, had this mom come up to me. Son's on our team. He's trying to play quarterback. He's not a quarterback. He's probably fourth string. The reason he's fourth string is there's not a fifth string. It's just not his talent. It's just not his ability. But over the summer, he took some coaching from somebody that tried to help him. Bless his heart. You know the bless your heart rule, don't you? If you say bless your heart, you can say anything you want about somebody. He's a great kid. He's just not a quarterback. And yesterday I had him play receiver some because in our offense we have 4 receivers. We just have 1 quarterback. He's got a better chance of getting on the field as a receiver than he does as a quarterback. And he's still playing both. He'll get some reps in there. But the mom came up to me after practice. And I was as nice as I could be, and I was kind. And I said what I think she wanted to hear. But the mom, she was looking through the mom goggles. And we have that. Spiritually, sometimes we have that. Spiritually, sometimes we're not able to really evaluate ourselves. Paul told the church at Corinth, test yourselves. Examine yourselves to see if you're in the faith. It's pretty important that we do that we examine ourselves. So examine yourself spiritually. Fill in that statement. My life is what? Can you answer the way Paul wrote in Colossians 3, verse 4? Can you truly and honestly say, my life is about Christ? Maybe to help us consider these questions. How often do you talk about Him? How often do you think about Him? How often do you talk to Him? How can you tell if somebody's devoted to somebody or to something? I have one rule. I have one definition of devotion. Time. If somebody is devoted to something, if somebody is devoted to someone, you can tell because of the time they invest. So, how much time do you invest in Jesus? How much time do you invest in talking to others about Him? How much time do you invest in talking to Him personally? How much time do you invest in thinking about Him? You want to know how to guard your mind? You want to know how to guard your heart? You want to know how to do what Solomon wrote about in Proverbs 4, verse 23? Here's the heart of it. Above all else, guard your heart. If you want to do it, talk about Jesus, talk to Jesus, and think about Jesus. And if you will do those things daily, if you'll do those things regularly, you're going to guard your heart. You're going to guard your mind. But if you don't, you're open season for Satan. And he's going to come firing. He's going to come in with his arsenal, trying to get in here, trying to get your mind. You go back and study World War II. You know what Hitler's strategy was? He wanted to win the minds of the young people. He wanted to win the minds of the youth. That was his strategy. And that is Satan's strategy today. Now, as we close, I want to think about that last statement there in verse 4. Because Paul reminds us that Jesus is coming back. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, He's coming back. Then you will also be revealed with Him in glory. There are two things that I can tell you without a doubt. Two things that I know for certain, two things that I would lay my life on right now at this very moment. Jesus is coming back. He's coming. Now, back in the first century, the people, they were anticipating it. Church at Thessalonica, when's it happening? Come on, Paul, we're ready. We're suffering. Tell Jesus to come back. And I can picture these Christians in the first century looking up into the clouds, looking up into the heavens, wondering, is this the moment when He's going to be passing through those clouds? That was people in the first century, Christians in the first century. They eagerly anticipated, they eagerly expected Jesus to come back every moment. We've lost that. We've lost that sense of urgency. We've lost that sense of excitement, that sense of expectation that right now could be the moment when Jesus comes back. I promise you, He's coming back. And here's the second thing I'll tell you. If you follow Jesus, you're going to go to heaven. What a statement. And that's not from me. That's from God. Can you believe that? If I will just simply follow Jesus, I'm going to make it to heaven. That's our hope. In this fallen world that we live in this challenging society that we're faced with every day, if you will just choose to follow Jesus, you're going to make it home. You're going to go to heaven. So guard your heart. Guard your mind. Think about Jesus. Talk to Jesus. Talk about Jesus. And if you'll do that, you'll accomplish what Solomon wrote. Above all else, guard your heart. In Mark chapter 10, a young man comes up to Jesus, and he comes to him in a hurry. And it's because Jesus is about to go off on a journey. And this man's probably thinking, this is my last chance, my last opportunity to see this man. So he rushes up to him, and he kneels before him. And he asks him a question of eternal significance. What must I do to inherit eternal life? Now we know that man as the rich young ruler. And that man was wealthy. That man had a lot of possessions. And they began to have a conversation. Very interesting dialogue takes place between Jesus and this young man. And initially they start talking about some commands because Jesus tells him, you got to keep the commandments. And this young man, he first talks about the horizontal commands that are a part of the Ten Commandments, the commands that have to do with our relationships with fellow man. And this particular young man had kept all of those. And he felt pretty good about everything that he had done. But then Jesus turns to the vertical commands. And he actually goes to the first command, the command to have no other idols before God. And we remember what Jesus said to him. At the end of this dialogue, Jesus says to him, there's one thing that you lack, one thing that's missing. You need to go and sell all of your possessions, sell all your stuff, give it to the poor, and then come follow me. When we hear Jesus say that, perhaps we think, wow, that sure seems extreme. Why would Jesus tell this guy to go and sell all of his stuff and give to the poor? You see, there was something that was standing between this man and God, and it was his stuff. It was his money. One of the things that I admire greatly about Jesus, one of the things that I appreciate about him and love about him, is Jesus never asks us to do anything that he's not willing to do. So when you look at that statement that Jesus made to him, was Jesus willing to do that? Without a doubt, yes. In fact, he had already done it. Jesus was the ultimate rich young ruler. Jesus was reigning at the right hand of God. We talked about that in our class, that's where Jesus is at now. Well, that's where Jesus was before he came down here to earth. You look at everything that Jesus had, he had relationship with. He was right there in heaven. He created all things. The wealth that Jesus had would have made the rich young ruler look poor. It would have made his wealth look like poverty. And what did Jesus do? Jesus left all of that behind. He left the riches of heaven to come down here to earth. Yes, he would do it. He did it. And so when he turned to the rich young ruler and said, you need to go sell all your stuff, sell everything that you have, give to the poor, and come follow me, he wasn't asking him to do something he wasn't willing to do. Here's what Jesus was asking him. And this is what we need to consider. Jesus was asking this man, am I enough? Picture the scene. This man, he rushes up to Jesus. He kneels before him. He looks up to Jesus and he asks him this question, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And a conversation unfolds. They talk back and forth. And Jesus, he gets to the heart of the matter and he's asking him, am I enough for you? Without your stuff, without your money, without your possessions, am I enough? If you had nothing, would I be enough? Can you answer that? Is Jesus enough? In Philippians chapter 4, Paul, he wrote about being content. There's a lot of people that are not content today. There are a lot of people in our country. There are a lot of Christians that are not content today. And Paul wrote that he had learned the secret of being content. It's something that he had to learn. And whether he had an abundance or whether he had nothing, he was still content. In fact, when he wrote that letter to the church at Philippi, he was sitting in a Roman prison cell. And still yet he could write, I have learned the secret of being content. Why? What was the secret? It was about Jesus. Paul had something in Jesus that was enough. Even when he was in prison, he still had Jesus, so that was enough. Even when he was shipwrecked, he still had Jesus, so that was enough. Even when he was being persecuted, he feared for his life, he still had Jesus, so that was enough. Whether he had an abundance of stuff or no stuff, if he had Jesus, he had enough. And that should be our mentality. There's so many people that try to find happiness in money. They try to find happiness in all of this physical stuff. You're not going to find it. True joy, lasting joy, is only found in a relationship with Jesus. Guys, there's some things you can't find on Amazon. Some things you can only find in God's Word. All we need is Jesus. So Jesus, while he was here on earth, he looked into the eyes of this rich young ruler, and he basically asked him, am I enough? And that question I propose to you tonight. Is Jesus enough? Oh, he's enough to save you. He's enough to get you to heaven. Is he enough to leave everything behind and just follow after him? You need to make that decision tonight. We give you this opportunity as we stand and sing together.